In discussing issues and challenges in teaching the Holodomor, I was interested in looking at the ways the Holodomor is different and the ways that it's the same as talking and teaching about other cases of genocide or mass violence or crimes against humanity. And I think the Holodomor has distinct challenges when we talk about it, when we teach about it. And I'll turn to those in a second. Uh, but what I'd like to do next is tell you just a little bit about HREC. So we are a project, as Elena said, of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. We've been around for nearly 12 years. Most of our funding has been thanks to the generosity of the Tamartev Foundation, but more recently we were joined by another family, the Bashutskis, and they have good Canadian, Western Canadian roots, and they have allowed us to expand our work, including the development of a 13-module online course on the Holodomor. It will be offered on the largest educational platform of its kind, Coursera, and you will be able to, it will be launched officially on March 23rd. You'll be able to register for it. Uh, so in one moment, I'll show you a brief kind of teaser for that. I'd just like to say before we get started that I know some of you may know quite a lot about the Holodomor. Others of you may know relatively little. Some of you may even be descendants of survivors. But regardless, I hope you'll find something interesting and new today. And with that, I think we will go to the clip.
For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union denied that millions of people died of starvation in the 1930s and that Soviet authorities were responsible. The Holodomor was little studied by academics, despite the enormity of the event. In this course, we'll explore the history and events surrounding the Holodomor, consider its causes, place it into historical and political context, and examine the long-term effects and memorialization of this tragic event. Some 3.5 million people in Ukraine were starved to death in the first half of 1933 alone. By highlighting the lived experiences of both victims and survivors of the Holodomor, we'll come to a greater understanding of how and why this tragic event was allowed to happen and why it remained in the dark for so many years.
Actually. So the brief taste of the course you just saw brings up some of the issues we'll be talking about today. When we talk about the Holodomor, we're often talking about something and with people who've never heard of it before. The word is strange. They wonder how can it be true if something of this scale happened and they don't know about it. So these are some of the issues that we grapple with in the course. But it's about so much more. As we designed the course, we wanted it to be useful to people not only in Ukrainian studies, not only in people in Soviet studies, but for example, someone teaching about famine could use the unit, the module on famine and just show that. Or if someone teaching about genocide would find the module that discusses how the Holodomor illustrates the definition of genocide. There's a module on culture, how the suppression of Ukrainian cultural figures, the executed Renaissance, how that was a part of the broader context of the Holodomor. There are two lessons about how people lived and how people died, the lived experience of the people who actually experienced the Holodomor and what some of the survival strategies were. There are modules on commemoration and the aftermath. How did communities grapple with the legacy of the Holodomor? How did they preserve memory? How did they share it? And this is all, so we could not have made this course when we started HREC 12 years ago. But because of the network of scholars that we have worked with and have developed relationships with and the research they've done, it's now possible to have a quality university level course. But this course will be available to anyone, anywhere in the world via Coursera for free as of March 23rd. And I hope you'll all take it. So back to some of the challenges of teaching about the Holodomor. I don't know if you've had this experience, but when you're talking about the Holodomor, depending on the audience, we can't even assume that people know where it happened. So when you talk about where did the Holodomor take place, the issue is further complicated by the fact that most of Ukraine has been divided between Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, and then later between the USSR and Poland. So that's a lot for people to take in. And for younger students, that's a challenge. How much do they need to understand the complicated history of Ukraine and its borders? Then you have the question of what is the time period? When did it start? When does our story start when we discuss the Holodomor? You may remember this book, Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. Well, we contributed some of the research to this project. And I remember in dealing with Anne Applebaum that she said when she began the project of writing Red Famine, she thought, oh, this book will be easier and less time consuming than my earlier projects. After all, the Holodomor took place over a relatively short period, 32 to 33, or probably more accurately, 32 to 34. But as she started writing, she realized that in order to provide enough context to understand the Holodomor, she had to go back to at least before the Soviet rule and the Russian Revolution and Ukrainian aspirations for independence, but even to discuss centuries of suppression of Ukrainian language and culture. So that that it's not an easy thing to explain the context of the Holodomor. Then you've got the word Holodomor itself. Many people are unfamiliar with the word, and it must be explained that there is an etymology, holod from starvation and hunger, and morete, to torture to death or exterminate. There have been people who thought that the word was basically taken to sound like Holocaust, but anyone who knows the Ukrainian language knows that the word holod is the word for famine or starvation. And how do we teach about a subject when there's very little in the way of visual material, especially in an age when it seems we are more and more image driven? If you look at this picture, this is an official Soviet photo. This is a photo of perpetrators, a brigade sent to a village to look for grain that Ukrainian peasant farmers would have hidden in order to survive. And this is these perpetrators basically gloating. You can see the fellow pointing his finger. They're showing, do you see the big holes in the ground? They have taken the metal rods that they're holding. They've poked around in people's ceilings, in their walls, in their yards until they found these barrels of hidden food. And and you see in the center a row of sacks. They have confiscated grain that the Ukrainian peasant farmers themselves grew, and this grain is being taken to fulfill unrealistic, ridiculously high grain requisitions that were required from Ukrainian villages to meet quotas set by Moscow. So we have very few images, and then the ones we have uh, we have some Soviet photos like this, but basically the Soviet authorities forbade foreign journalists from traveling to Ukraine during the Holodomor, so there's little visual documentation. And as I say, here we have one that at the time the people who took this photo thought it was a positive photo showing the success of grain requisitioning. Here we have another photo from this series. I had read in survivor testimonies about the brigades coming with their metal rods and poking. And then one day someone sent this set of photos, and had chills in my spine. Like, there's the metal rods, there's the metal rods. And here again, you see a man standing in the hole that they've dug because they've managed to uncover the grain that was hidden in order for people to survive once the requisitions became uh, beyond punishing, but really the requisitions of such high numbers that it meant certain death that you wouldn't survive the winter. And then we have the issue when you're dealing with children that the very few photos that we do have, authentic photos taken from the time of the Holodomor, many of them are too graphic to show younger audiences. There are less than a handful of four Westerners that were in Ukraine at the time that managed to take photos and that have been preserved. The one we're looking at is from the most important of those photographers, Alexander Wienerberger, an Austrian engineer who was working in Kharkiv, which was the capital of Ukraine in 32-33, and he surreptitiously took photos and managed to get them out through diplomatic pouch. And as striking and upsetting and as important as his photos are, they're taken in the center in Kharkiv, the city and its immediate outskirts. They are not even showing the horror of the Ukrainian village, which would have been much worse. These are more of Alexander Wienerberger's photos. This is also a Wienerberger photo, and I leave it to you, the teachers, to decide what kind of images are too disturbing for younger audiences to illustrate what the Holodomor was. I mentioned that we have just a handful of sets of photographs for Western photographers. There's one set of photographs by a native, this man here, Nikolai Bokan from Chernihiv Oblast. He was a amateur photographer and he documented the suffering of his family. And here he is standing in front of his son Konstantin's grave. And the plaque says, uh, uh, remembering Konstantin Bokan, who died of overwork and exhaustion on the collective farm. So the family didn't have enough to eat. The son Konstantin went to the collective farm thinking that he would fare better, and he collapsed and died. I would like to point out, though, sometimes an image is says more than an essay or an article could possibly say. I've found that when I read the research of scholars, there's much to be studied in analyzing, crunching the numbers of, for example, crop planting and harvests and tons and harvest yields and the amount of grain that the Soviets sold on the international market. All that plays into how the Holodomor took place. But the toll on humanity is harder to quantify. And it's in the end the human stories that are powerful in conveying the horror of the Holodomor. You've all heard the term kulak, dekulakization. This was the prelude to the Holodomor when the Bolsheviks who had taken power came into villages and they arrested the most successful farmers. They were branded kulaks, which meant that they were parasites. They were people who could afford sometimes to hire another laborer, or they had two cows and not one. Over time, the term kulak came to be meaningless. It basically meant you were someone they didn't trust, and they considered you an enemy of Soviet power. So there's a lot to be studied about kulaks, dekulakization, about the numbers of people who are dispossessed of their belongings or evicted from their homes or sent to the gulags or even shot. But when I look at this photo and see the face of the little girl, um, what it says about loss and despair and despondence, I don't think an academic article can capture. So I've been talking about some of the challenges in talking about and studying the Holodomor. Um, we've talked about just the foreignness of it, the word, where it took place, the fact that it was for so long very little known. One thing I meant to say was that the Soviet authorities, as I mentioned, they didn't allow foreign journalists to go to Ukraine, but they also kept the archives closed until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So for more than 50 years, the Soviet Union, the authorities that perpetrated the Holodomor, denied that it had happened, and they refused access to the archives that would have confirmed what the few survivors who got out and talked about the Holodomor materials in the archives would have confirmed what the survivors said. So, for example, if once the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives became accessible, you could learn that, in fact, top Ukrainian communists had alerted Moscow, had told the Kremlin. Stalin did know that people were starving, that if they insisted on carrying out the grain requisitions, famine would only worsen. And despite that knowledge, the authorities actually raised grain requisitioning. So there had been sort of a school of thought like, well, maybe there had been a famine, but they didn't know about it in the Kremlin. It was maybe people were a little overzealous in carrying out grain requisitioning at the local level. No, once the archives were opened up, it was confirmed that the authorities were very well informed and pursued their policies regardless. So, yeah, despite all this grimness, and I think when we're dealing with young people, we do look for, it can't be just an unending story of despair. And there are authentic stories of hope and courage that we can share with young people about the Holodomor, even in circumstances as harrowing as the Holodomor. One such story is a story of Ria Kleiman. Those of you who teach about and have taught about the Holodomor, you might be aware of her. And that's an interesting story in itself, how we know about Ria Kleiman. And it might be interesting to students. I think we assume today that anything that's knowable or worth knowing, we can Google and it'll be on the internet. Well, 12 years ago when we started HREC, if you had Googled Ria Kleiman, nothing would have come up. It was about then that Yars Balan and researchers at University of Alberta were looking into Canadian grain policy to sort of understand what was happening during the Holodomor with international grain policy. And Serhiy Tsipko at University of Alberta and Yars Balan were on this project. And sitting in dusty libraries looking at microfilm, they find out that there was this reporter, Ria Kleiman, who actually wrote extensively about the Holodomor. We don't know about her because the newspaper she wrote for went out of business. It defunct. It had never been digitized. It had never been put online. So it was almost as though it hadn't happened, as though it hadn't existed. Today, if you Google her name, there's been quite a bit written about her. What you're looking at on this screen is material that Sofia Isaev from the Holodomor Research Education Consortium's Education Division, she prepared this and it's available on the HREC website. If you go to our website, very easy to remember, holodomor.ca. There's a button that says education on the top of our masthead, and you can find this printable material about this hero. So she was a young woman born in Poland and raised in a poor Jewish family in Toronto. She lost her leg beneath the knee in a streetcar accident when she was only 6 years old. She was a true believer. She wanted to see the communist experiment. She went to Moscow believing that they were building a workers' paradise. She was quickly disillusioned and a principled person. She got herself to Ukraine and wrote, eventually gets kicked out of the Soviet Union and wrote a series of just heart-wrenching articles about what she witnessed. And as I say, 12 years ago, you would not have found any of this on the internet. You can see one of her articles here. Then there's a picture of her there to the left. And there's her route from Moscow driving to Kharkiv. Just to throw in another challenge in talking about the Holodomor, the way people spoke about the Soviet Union at the time was often to call it Russia. So you can see Toronto girl, she was probably about 25 at the time, Toronto girl's 5,000-mile trip through the famine lands of Russia. But in fact, what they're talking about is Kharkiv. This is a photo of Rhea Kleiman, and there's a story behind this one too. So I mentioned that no one would have heard of her when we started this project 12 years ago. Yars Balan became fascinated. He's been researching every aspect of her life, her reporting, and he's writing a book about her. But it was a frustration that he had no photos of her. There were only these grainy photos from the newspapers. So when we started this Holodomor course that we've been developing, we were in contact with the estate of the photographer James Abbey. He was a photographer. He took some quite famous photos of Joseph Stalin, and he has a few of the photos that we consider photos from the Holodomor period. His granddaughter very generously sent us whole batches of photos, and you can imagine our shock and delight as we went through the photos when we came upon this one. Whoops. And on the back of it, that says that this is Rhea Kleiman the night before her expulsion from the USSR. Basically, what had happened was she drove to Kharkiv and she went on to Georgia, where the secret police arrested her and brought her back to Moscow and forced her out of the country. Perhaps the most accessible way to share what the Holodomor was and what the impact was is through the stories of the survivors. A few years back, a colleague at CIUS heard about a 100-year-old survivor from Saskatchewan who had never been interviewed about the Holodomor. And that was because he was part of a Protestant emigration from the USSR and not in the circles of the organized Ukrainian community that many of us know. So he had never been part of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress commemorations. Uh, he he was unknown to most people in the community. So that the woman you see pictured there is the director of CIUS, Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. She conducted a lengthy interview with him. And the Canadian Museum for Human Rights now features an excerpt from that interview in an exhibit highlighting testimonies of survivors of genocide and atrocities. And if this works, I'll show you just a little bit of it. Oops.
Одне свідчення було, що наш сусід через 2-3 доми, він утік якось з полону. І як він, як він добирався до своєї хати, невідомо, але уже це було е, збіжжя, яке він посіяв на своєму городі, і він дійшов до того збіжжя і умер в тому збіжжі. Мер. І люди почули запах від якоїсь причини. Але коли добрались, відкуди йде цей запах, то знайшли його, бідного, вже вмершого, вже потерпівши, який пішов додому. Але сім'ї не було з ним. І він знайшов свою домівку. Тяжко було це бачити і чути. Але слава Богу, що ми пережили цей час, надіясь на Бога, надіясь на Його силу, на Його підтримку. І це було для нас велике щастя, що ми мали Божу милість над нами.
I shared that with you because I'm always moved that people 80 years after the event are still brought to tears. And I think it's important we know that this survivor was interviewed only a few years ago on his 100th birthday, and that today an excerpt from that interview is part of an exhibit at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So it's a true Canadian survivor story that is part of all of our heritage now. Some resources you may find interesting and useful can be found on the HREC website. As I say, holodomor.ca. Here on the screen, you see in the upper right there, education. You can go directly to materials that were designed and curated with teachers and educators in mind. As well, there's a section called HREC Special Collections that I'd like to bring your attention to. In that section, there are the authenticated photos I mentioned from those few photographers. We were very fortunate that a dedicated librarian named Lana Babi took it upon herself to once and for all determine which photos are authentically from the Holodomor. There had been a problem earlier that in trying to illustrate the Holodomor, there were a number of photos being used from an earlier famine from the 1920s. Now, in the 1920s, the Soviet Union had a famine, and it admitted so, and it allowed in international aid workers. So the International Red Cross was very active, and they documented what they saw. During the Holodomor, there was no such admission that there was a famine. The Soviet Union actually refused the International Red Cross when it offered food aid. So there were no photos by international aid organizations. But later on, Ukrainians and others would sometimes come upon photos and not know which famine it was from. They would use photos from the 20s. And then the people who wanted to cast doubt on the Holodomor would say that obviously it didn't really happen because they're using photos from the 1920s. So Lana, the librarian, authenticated, she found the instance, earliest instance of use of every photo and has made this useful resource on our website, HREC Online Holodomor Photo Directory. The next one I'm pointing out is the Manyak collection. Volodymyr Manyak was a journalist. He and his wife, Kononenko, when it became possible finally to talk about the Holodomor at the very end of the Soviet Union, they put out a call for testimonies, memoirs, and received thousands of responses. We have many of those letters with transcripts and in some cases translations available on our website. And then there's actual video interviews. So we'll take a look at some of this now. The video interviews with Canadian survivors of the Holodomor, I think there's so much we can learn. There's so much ripe for discussion. In the interviews, we learn, for one thing, many details about how the Holodomor was perpetrated, conducted, details of how it played out in specific villages. We learn about survival strategies. What did people do to survive? What did they eat? We also find out about how it affected them, long-term impact on their lives. It's also we also learn a lot about human resilience. How did people make sense and go on with their lives in the aftermath of the Holodomor? We'll see if we can take a quick look at this.
Колі, один такий хлопчик. Дехто таке мали таке. Мене то переслідує до сьогодні, то все. Стільки років, уже майже 80 років доходить, що я то ношу в серці і в пам'яті, і розказую дітям, і то впливає на ціле моє життя, тому що я не можу кусочка хліба викинути у сміття. Не можу. Сняться ті жінки, що з дітьми маленькими коло дверей підходили, приходили, дайте кусочок хліба, моя дитина вмирає. Дайте кусочок хліба, дайте. А мама не раз давала.
Oops. Bear with me a second. I'm sorry about this. What can I do here? Yeah, when I I seem to have shut something else. Okay.
Мене змобілізували, я був студентом Київського будівельного інституту, і нас мобілізували на збиральну, так би мовити, компанію по допомогу збирати врожай, бо багато людей вимерло. Поставили мене виключно збирати людей на то, кликати людей. Довелося обходити всі хати. Всі хати. І такий трагічний випадок. В одній хаті я побачив пухлу дівчину. Коли я сказав, що треба йти на працю, вона каже, бачите, я не можу, я пухла. І я запам'ятав цю хату. І нам давали пайку глизьового хліба. І я її на слідчий день відніс її. Відніс. Зробив це другий раз. Що ж ви думаєте? Партієць той, що очолював, йому донесли, що я годую. Він викликав мене і каже, слухай, Ревуцький, що ти робиш? Ти годуєш ворогів народу. Ну от така от.
І крали вас чи як?
Кара була для мене, поставили мене при молотарці під горнавти солому, знаєте, яка шла з барабана. Праця дуже важка. Я 2 дні витримав, а на початку 3-го дня знепритомнів. Між іншим, що трапилось, це я бачив сам, що в Руді був елеватор, де складали зерно. То розумієте, то було напис на 100 метрів не підходити до елеватора. Як хто переходив себе, то стріляли просто ті вартові стріляли людей.
І ви це бачили?
Так.
Чи ви
Зерна було досить. Зерна було досить. То я був задуманий зарані страшний геноцид українського народу.
I think an important point to make when we hear the words of Valerian Revutsky, when you think about the extremism of that ideology, that bringing his bread ration to a starving girl who was swollen with hunger was considered feeding the enemy of the people. And I think that's a theme that can resonate today. People understand the danger of extremist ideologies that pit one group against another, that call one group an enemy of the people, that demonize a group of people. And I think that interview excerpt illustrates that very in a really clear and the brutality of it, that someone could look at a starving girl and think that she was an enemy of the people who didn't deserve to eat, who basically deserved to die. We're coming to the end of the time allotted. I think you get a sense that you can look through these, you can listen and kind of experience these survivor interviews that are accessible. They are now on the website of the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. We also have a link on our website. They were originally done through the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And it's amazing foresight that the community had to ensure that these interviews were done when it was still possible to capture these memories of these survivors. We have another survivor here talking about how the long-term impact on her, that she could never, that it pained her even to see people leaving food on their plates at restaurants to be thrown away. I mentioned the letters available on their website. I think there's something powerful about seeing these physical letters that you see that someone took the time to write a letter. They bothered to get an envelope and address it. They sent it to Volodymyr Maniak. They wanted someone to hear their memories. If I can, we'll take a quick, if it loads. It's really pretty remarkable. Here you see, this is live. We're on the website. These are the letters. You can click on, here's a pretty envelope. You can click on it. You can see the original letter. Well, in this case, we have a typed note to the editor. This fellow has included a newspaper clip he thought was important to share. So these letters, there's a selection of them. You can look for the ones that are translated into English if that's something you need. But they're also searchable. For example, you can search for everything from the word orphanage. That's an area of research is how did the orphanage system, what part did it play during the Holodomor? You can search the word cow. You'd be surprised how many recollections of survival turn on someone managing to save one cow. And then researchers can use it, but so could teachers or students, the Maniac collection. Just to give you a sense of, that a human being wrote this. And I'll just leave to end with a quote from one of the letters. Well, thank you all for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Marta. Yes, thank you for this meaningful presentation. And now we'll move to the question answer session. Anyone who has any questions, please ask.
I'd just like to make a comment. Thank you very much, Marta, for sharing with us the great variety of resources that you have amassed that will definitely help people of all ages to understand this horrific event in human history. I was reminded of visiting Hiroshima and Dachau and other places where world crimes against humanity have been created, and the powerful message of video recordings. And what I appreciate how difficult it is to find those things. But when you see someone after 80 years, and you can tell with his eyes closed how he's remembering that event, that really speaks so strongly. And that's very powerful. Yeah. Thanks for everyone who's contributed to that.
Well, and I hope for people who consider themselves member of the Ukrainian community, I think that the community can feel proud of the job that has been done in preserving the voices of these survivors. And in doing that, ensuring that the memories of the people that the perpetrators sought to erase have been preserved. Well, if anybody has at any time any question or need of resources, HREC exists to promote awareness and knowledge, and we do consider our mandate to help out in any way we can if people have a sincere interest in the Holodomor.
Thank you. And I see a hand. Please, Dr. Eduard Baidaus.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Marta, for your presentation. I hope you can hear me well. I'm a bit sick, so my voice is a bit different, but I am the same man. My area of research is Holodomor on the border with Romania and Bessarabia, Moldova, and I'm looking into the textbooks published in Moldova and Romania. And by the way, the latest textbook published in Moldova is taught history of Romanians, not history of Romania, history of the nation. So it's a different issue. So when I look into collectivization, I looked into Holodomor, almost nothing. So, and I talked with the authors of the textbook, with some of people I know over there from academia. Said, look, why you claim Transnistria, it's part of Moldova, and not claim by law, okay? It's part of the Moldovan Republic, but part of Transnistria today was part of Ukraine. So people who live there, regardless of the ethnic belonging, Moldovans, Ukrainians, Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, they suffer. So why you didn't mention that? And they said, well, our primary focus is the famine of 1946-47, which also occurred in Soviet Ukraine. But they don't touch this subject. Like, I'm in a way, I'm trying to push them to struggle, but it's not easy. Anyways, I will deal with this as I do, and I will do. But my question is a different one. So this program is an excellent program. It's an English language program, which covers probably Canada, United States, I guess. I'm not sure about UK, Australia, because Ukrainian community is strong all over the world. So in addition to for English-speaking communities, Ukrainians, and not only, are there any plans to have these similar programs, let's say, in the countries which were bordering before or during the Holodomor or nowadays with Ukraine, like Poland, Romania, Hungary? Maybe I'm not aware of, could be. But what about other?
I think it's a brilliant idea that we have to follow up on. We're just getting our online course available, but I hope that will prompt more research. We just did a round of research grants, and we're getting more applications about border regions. In other countries, people are interested in this issue, but it's taken time. I just wanted to add to, also, I wanted to point out to people who are watching that we have with us Edward Baidos, who was our very first, I believe, Temerte postdoctoral fellow in Ukrainian studies at the University of Alberta. When we established this postdoctoral fellowship, Dr. Baidos was our first fellow. So it's nice to have you on the call on the webinar. I wanted to mention, some of you might have heard of the resource 17 Moments in Soviet History. It's a very well-known website that I think both university and post-secondary teachers use. In its day, it was state of the art. With it, there are 17 moments in Soviet history, and it has music from the time and documents and sort of multimedia. But the Holodomor is basically a footnote to collectivization. That the death by starvation of millions of people is, and through excesses, millions of peasants died, is about the attention the Holodomor gets in 17 moments in Soviet history. So that's kind of a wrong that we're trying to right.
Okay, thank you. I'll check it too. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have a few minutes, so maybe more questions. Roman Petreshin, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. So the question I've written, but I'll ask it orally as well. Does your work include mention of the 32-33 famine in other parts of the USSR? In order to have some kind of comparative and a larger sense of the phenomenon. For example, in Kazakhstan, is Kazakhstan mentioned in this package of 13?
Yes. We have a section on the Kazakh famine in the. When we use the term Holodomor, we are talking about in Ukraine specifically, that term is reserved for the famine in Ukraine. But that's not to say that other parts of the Soviet Union didn't suffer from famine, and the Kazakhs in particular. But that was a different phenomenon. They died as much from the taking of their herds, their meat, not from grain requisitions. So and it was earlier as well. It started sooner, but they actually died in a greater percentage of their people died than in Ukraine. It was, estimates are a third to half of, maybe third is what is most known. And some people do comparative work. Unfortunately, there's relatively little documentation of that famine and very little very little survivor testimony, and too few scholars read or speak Kazakh. That's another issue. And the Kazakhs themselves don't particularly encourage research because of the politics of their government. Recently, it's actually gone backwards in Kazakhstan. There was a monument where the language has now been changed to be less potentially anti-Soviet, I guess they don't want to upset Putin. So there are definitely some challenges to studying the Kazakh famine. But there are a couple of scholars. There's a woman named Sarah Cameron who has a book on it. We've had her at our conferences. We had a conference called Communism and Hunger, where we looked at, every conference that HREC does, we try to demonstrate to a new audience why the Holodomor is relevant to their area of study. So, for example, a conference on empire and colonialism, where you look, and famine. So you look at the famine in Ireland, commonalities and differences with the Holodomor. In the case of the Communism and Hunger conference, we had Chinese scholars talking about the famine in China and experts on the Kazakh famine talking about the role of communist ideology in those famines. So that's all to say that we're interested in the topic. It's not our primary area. If, for example, a scholar would apply to us for our research grant, wanting to do comparative work, we would welcome that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again. And to wrap up, I'll pass the word to Maria.
Yep. Thank you so much, Marta, for a very interesting and insightful webinar. And this is a very heavy and sensitive topic, and I believe that your webinar is extremely important for parents and teachers across Alberta and beyond. And we truly appreciate your sharing your knowledge and experience with us today and the valuable resources. And to our audience, if you enjoyed the webinar, please take a moment to complete our short feedback form. You can find the link in the chat. And thank you again, Marta, and thank you for being with us today to all of our audience. Thank you.
It was my pleasure, and I look forward to working with Ulrich in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just a quick reminder that we send out a summary of about this webinar along with the link to the video, and it will be available within a few days. So you're welcome to share it with others. We certainly will be circulating it to schools, social studies teachers in Alberta across the province, since in grade 11, this is a topic that is touched upon. And try to do more outreach to other provinces where teachers could benefit from the links and background that you presented today. Thank you. And we have another couple of webinars coming up at the beginning of February. Please watch for our ads, our publicity, and we hope to see you again there.
Thank you.